One of my favorite LSAT mindset hacks, and this is the one that transformed my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175, was coming to see the LSAT from the test maker's point of view. In other words, understanding what goes into creating LSAT questions. What are they thinking as they design those tricks and traps that lure the unsuspecting test taker into making some huge mistake without even realizing it? I learned a ton when I wrote my own LSAT questions from scratch. I wasn't just taking official LSAT questions and changing the topics or anything like that. I was writing my own LSAT questions with their own unique logic. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. So what I help my students do is I help them take existing LSAT questions and transform them from one question type into another based on the underlying logic and structure. So if you are familiar with parallel reasoning questions, which are basically just making arguments by analogy, you could think about what is a way I could create an analogous structure, an analogous situation to better understand the logic of the question that is in front of me. So we take a given LSAT logical reasoning argument, which is that paragraph, the stimulus, and we transform it from one question type into another. So we take a strengthened question and turn it into a weakened question, into a flaw question, into a necessary assumption question. If you're struggling more with LSAT reading comprehension rather than logical reasoning, you could try rewriting the entire reading comprehension passage in simpler language, in your own words, to get rid of that complex sentence structure, the complex language, the difficult arguments, and better understand the patterns in the reasoning. Not just patterns in question types or in answer choices, but patterns in the passage, the stimulus, the reasoning they are presenting you with. I find that far too many students fall into the trap of drilling LSAT questions by type. There are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions alone, which means that if you're doing nothing but drilling LSAT flaw questions, for example, it might be days or weeks or even months before you get to another type of logical reasoning question that you really need to be dealing with. But maybe your issue isn't with LSAT question stem types at all, but rather it's with the method of reasoning in the stimulus. In other words, do you actually understand the arguments they are showing you? Because if you don't, of course, it's a lost cause. So as an LSAT coach, a lot of what I do is help students slow down and actually take the time to understand what they're reading. This is part of my LSAT Socratic review method framework, where I help you learn how to learn. I help you learn how to review your mistakes better so that you can avoid making them again in the future. So I help you better understand the argument or the passage. I help you better understand the question stem. I help you better understand the answer choices, specifically what makes the wrong answer choices tempting and what ultimately makes them wrong, what makes the right answer choices unappealing, and what ultimately makes them correct, because you have these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answers and traps of discouragement away from the right answers. And until you understand which tricks and traps you personally are uniquely prone to falling for, you may just end up making the same mistakes again and again. And of course, I want to help you avoid doing that so that we can get your scores into the 170s and beyond. And so for that reason, at LSAT Unplugged, we demonstrate the Socratic review method framework live in class several nights a week. They're all recorded for any that you can't make, and we have literally hundreds of them in the library already since we've been doing these since even before the pandemic. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below the video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And of course, all of this is regardless of LSAT question type. If you are not yet at that point where you're ready for this framework, we can also help you build that strong foundation from the beginning. Whatever program you've used in the past, we want to help you, of course, focus on indicator words for necessary and sufficient conditions, indicator words for evidence and conclusion. These will carry you far. If you don't know them, you're in trouble, and so you want to start there. And of course, there is a big benefit to focusing on logical reasoning right now, because in 2024, the LSAT is in a transitional period. Of course, after the June LSAT, they are removing the logic game section and replacing it with a second scored logical reasoning section. And so if you're taking the LSAT in June, you probably like logic games more than logical reasoning, or else why wouldn't you have waited to take the LSAT in August after they remove games? So those taking in June probably don't love logical reasoning, which means you probably need to focus there rather than procrastinating on your weak areas by doing more of what you do like, such as logic games. Maybe you need to stop focusing on games and you really need to be working more on logical reasoning and reading comp. I'm sure someone watching this out there right now is feeling called out, like, how do you know? So if that's you, drop a comment right now below the video to let me know. And if you're taking the LSAT in August, of course, the importance of logical reasoning is doubled because they are replacing the logic game section with a second scored logical reasoning section. That's right. Logical reasoning will be 2/3 of the test going forward, starting in August. And so any gains you make there will be automatically doubled across the two sections. And so for this reason, at LSAT Unplugged, we're still covering logic games until the June LSAT in our live classes, but we're also giving additional focus to logical reasoning for those who want to give this section more attention, maybe because it's a weak area or because logical reasoning will be doubled starting with the August LSAT. Now, given the importance of logical reasoning, I want to share with you 3 quick wins for logical reasoning that you can implement right away. First, make sure that you are crystal clear on the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. Far too many students are confused about the difference between these types when, of course, they are asking for very different things. You also want to make sure that you are clear on the difference between must be true questions and most strongly supported questions. They are, again, asking for very different things, and a lot of students will get confused about weakened questions versus flaw questions. Flaw questions are simply asking you to identify a problem with the argument. Weakened questions ask you to expose a gap or make the conclusion less likely given the evidence. Note also that weaken does not mean destroy the argument, just make the conclusion less likely. Now, of course, when you're studying logical reasoning, you want to make sure that you master the most common question types before covering the ones that hardly ever show up. In our courses, we cover all 15 or so logical reasoning question types, plus the most important methods of reasoning, because as I said earlier, it's not always about the question stem type. Now, if you're currently scoring below 160, you want to focus on the most common types like necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. But if you're scoring 160 or above, it's time to take your prep to the next level and start thinking about methods of reasoning, not just the question stem types. And going forward, of course, there may be more focus on the LSAT covering numbers versus percentages, absolute versus relative reasoning, and formal logic stimuli. Given the removal of the logic game section, they might be testing some more of those concepts in the logical reasoning section. So again, if you'd like my help with those, you can check out the links below. We'd be glad to help. And in the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.